When people push back on the arguments I make, one thing that I've heard, and I've heard this from attorney colleagues and others as well, is they'll say, well, how can you say that the law was fair to women? Women were basically chattel under the law. They use this term chattel. I think this analysis is not correct. Chattel, as we understand that term today, that's not an appropriate way to describe the status of women under the law in the past. And some of this is hard to understand because we don't have a good idea of how the law developed. The law always struggled. Even now, you could say, in modern times, this is a problem too. The law always struggles how to compensate people who are wronged in some way. So for instance, and I talk about this more in Chapter 3 on the sexual misconduct issue, but take, for instance, a father in the past had a daughter. And let's say that a man in the community had relations with the daughter, and so she wasn't a virgin anymore. Well, you had a problem now, because that man, he's going to have a hard time marrying off his daughter. Back then, a woman who lost her virginity prior to marriage, that was a big deal for a lot of reasons I won't get into right now, but it was a big deal, and that harmed her marriage prospects. So now the father is facing the prospect of having a daughter who can't get married, can't have a man taking care of her. So now he's facing the prospect of having to take care of her for the rest of his life. Well, how do you compensate a man in a situation like that? Well, you have to kind of look at it as a property interest. And I think that's where this idea of chattel came from. There is some sense, it is true, there is some sense in which the law recognizes a man's property interest in his wife or in his daughter. But as I pointed out in Chapter 3, those interests were very closely related to the man's duty to provide for his wife or his daughter. And especially men and their wives. We'll talk about that in Chapter 2. Men had very, very strict obligations under the law to provide for women. So these rights and obligations went both ways. So this idea that women were just merely chattel, as we understand that today, not correct. Something that's oft repeated, but I think very poorly understood.